Hello, today is Friday, July 24th. Welcome to episode 617 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that typically gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. For the summer, right now, we're doing once a week and going a little deeper on a few issues. We've talked about NATO, we've talked about the Iran war. Today, we are joined by special guest Dinny McMahon, who's head of China markets research at Trivium. My name is John Lipsey. I'm a senior fellow at NSI. I'm joined by Lester Munson, an advisory board member at NSI. So we're going to go deep on China today, unpack China's economy, its economic model, the impact it's having on the United States, on Europe. Dinny, thanks for being here and helping to educate us on this. Trivium is a China policy research firm, but Dinny, why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Trivium?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for having me, John. Trivium is, as you said, it's a China-focused policy research firm. We got people spread around the globe, but we've got offices in Beijing and Shanghai. And what we do is provide research for both corporations and investors. And our starting point with everything is getting our arms around what China is doing from a policy perspective, because on one level, China's quite funny because it seems like a black box from the outside looking in, but it is amazing how much information is actually published within the system. And so we spend an inordinate amount of time going through what the Chinese are saying to themselves in terms of policy documents, in terms of sort of the internal policy debate to kind of try and get our arms around exactly what's going on.
Yeah. So in addition to heading up that China market research for Trivium, Denny also has published a book, China's Great Wall of Debt. So please check that out. So I'm going to take a little privilege on the front end here just to do a little scene setting for why I think that this is a important issue for us to grapple with a little more than maybe we have in the past. We're also going to it's also going to help tee up our conversation for next week that we have planned around U.S. trade policy and economic security policy on the back of some big trade news this week that we expect to get from the president with the current tariff regime expiring on Friday to be replaced by the new tariff regime. So I think this conversation is going to really help inform our understanding for that conversation. So I think, one of the ways I think about the U.S. approach to China and its economic system and the impact its economy has had on the U.S. is it's actually been significantly led by the national security community. So the national security community in D.C. started to identify, particular concrete, discrete risks. So, whether it was IP theft or tech transfer or cybersecurity or the hollowing out of the U.S. industrial base, supply chain risks. That's the lens that I think the U.S. has largely come at the issue from, and that's been largely led by the national security community identifying these risks, identifying these concerns. So that's been a different angle on the issue than from a purely economic, through an economic lens or through a trade lens. And that's frankly not something that national security folks typically do very much or well. We hear rumors that there are economists in the State Department. We're not sure what they do there. We discovered that Treasury can sanction people, and so we've taken advantage of that. We learned about this thing called SWIFT. It turned out to be particularly useful at times. We like money laundering laws and the like, but we don't really, typically understand well how the global economy functions and works. President Company excluded, of course. Les, is a Chicago guy, so big Milton Friedman fan. Grab a beer with him. He'll he'll bore you with his discussion of treasury markets and national savings rates. But
100%.
last notwithstanding, sometimes anyway, I think that this conversation is going to be helpful for our audience. I also think as we've thought about confronted the China question, we've brought along a lot of sort of baggage to it or biases around the assumptions around the benefits and the of the international rules-based order. When it comes to the economy, we took sort of things for granted around that. That is something forged by the U.S., the global trade system, that it had benefited the U.S. for decades, that it aligned with our values around free markets and the like. So something that we were, the U.S., but including the national security community, reluctant to really confront or think, rethink or think anew about. So I think as we've kind of dealt with discrete issues, there's been a lot of thrashing around and playing whack-a-mole. We're trying to do reshoring. We're in different ways. Where the Biden administration tried heavy subsidies. The Trump administration is trying tariffs. It's unclear whether any of it is successful so far or how successful it will be. So I think we've also had a conceit that China state capitalism is not something that is ultimately in the long run something that is efficient and will work, and that we would our system, our capitalist system, would outcompete. And so any protectionism or any intervention was counterproductive. And so industrial policy has been something that's very uncomfortable. And so I don't think we've respected enough what China has been able to accomplish and is accomplishing with their economic model. Whether it will have some fundamental failing in the long term, a lot of damage can be done before you get there. So, and frankly, the U.S. is playing with its own version of state capitalism to a large degree at this stage. So we need to understand what China is doing, what its impact is, how we should be responding to it at a more fundamental level. So that's the goal for today. Denny, I'm going to throw it over to you. What is this, manufacturing colossus, this behemoth of an economy that we're confronting? What's the economic model in China?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's really interesting when we talk about China's economic model, almost as though I think there's an inclination to think of it as being sort of preserved in amber. It is, it's a communist country. It has a model. It's unchanging. And the reality is it keeps sort of shifting. And we're at the moment, we're in a period of one of those fairly quite radical shifts. And so when we look at China and we look at it as a manufacturing behemoth, sure, it has been that for 25, 30 years at this point. But we're going through a period at the moment where it is doubling down on that, or on manufacturing as kind of the central driver of the economy in a way that it didn't play, and it didn't really play that role in terms of how in terms of the relevance of China's domestic economy up until about the last few years. So when we're trying to get our arms around what the Chinese economy is, it's necessary to understand what it used to be and what it could have become. So, for most foreigners, our experience of the Chinese economy, I remember when I was a kid, my experience of Chinese economy was looking at where toys were made, or sort of, labels on our shirts. And there was decades, there was a sense of China's contribution to the global economy, at least, was through the manufacture of relatively cheap stuff. But what was really driving China's economy domestically was actually the property market. So when we were looking at sort of annual GDP growth rates of 10%, it got up to 12% at some point. It wasn't because they were exporting widgets. It was because they were building homes. And that was real growth. That was meeting real economic demand. You look back at the late 1990s and you look at China's housing stock. It was an absolute nightmare. And so when the authorities back then liberalized the housing market in response to the Asian financial crisis, because up until then, all urban housing was state owned, either by a government agency or by state owned enterprises. I mean, the quality of what was available was awful. I mean, people working for government agencies, sharing a kitchen, sharing bathrooms. I mean, you go to some facilities, there'd be sort of tents or demountables in the courtyard because there were too many people and not enough housing. And so when they liberalized the housing market, there was real demand, and it drove an economy from the late 90s up until about 2020. And that demand was driven by providing quality that hadn't previously existed. It was housing an an expanding population. It was housing this massive migration of people from the countryside to the cities as they were sort of taking up industrial jobs, and it was upgrading. You know, as Chinese people became richer and more affluent, they didn't want pokey little apartments anymore. They wanted somewhere bigger, high, better quality, elevators and kitchens and the whole thing. And so you had this real demand driven by housing with a whole lot of knock-on effects. I mean, when you're doing this, you need better infrastructure as well, which kind of drove local government investment. The auto sector was driven by expanding cities, white goods, furniture, just the whole thing. It was a real engine of growth for a very long time. Now, of course, by the
And
time
just to inject, so and the that was sort of a developing middle class, I guess, if you will, that could afford that housing, or the folks at least that were moving to urban areas that were growing at an incredible rate, fueled really by the to some degree, right, the sort of the first China shock, right, of expand entry into the WTO, this rampant globalization, like you said, the sort of low tech manufacturing and the like, and that's sort of the first China shock that, or the time around the first China shock that the U.S. And others felt.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you had an increase in employment, employment relating to exports, and that was creating corporate profits, and it was creating better paying jobs and expanded a middle class that could afford housing and furniture and whatnot. It generated the drive of people from the countryside to the cities to take up those sorts of industrial jobs. But also as you're then building more infrastructure and housing, it justifies an expansion of steel manufacturing and aluminium production. And so it all kind of comes together as a sort of a big, sort of a broader model or a broader machine. But very much at the center of all this was the banks lending more and more money to property developers and housing, which allowed, property developers and households, and to local governments, which sort of facilitated all of this construction work. It was very much a debt-driven construction model, which was really at the center of how China managed to consistently grow at 10 or 12% annually. Like the export piece is important, but it doesn't kind of translate into these ridiculously high growth rates that we kind of grew accustomed to through about the first 20 years of the 21st century.
And so this was one of the first, the big sort of hanging property bubble that was sort of one of the things that that you might point to as evidence of the economic model having these excesses or these consequences that someday the house of cards will fall, or this would be the thing that when it fell, it would have sort of devastate the economy, and it was a ticking time bomb for China, and that was sort of evidence that in the competition between the U.S. and China, that was something that that China watchers sort of assumed would have significant consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you looked at the sheer scale of empty housing built around China, like newly constructed apartments with nobody living in them. I mean, the poster child of all this was, ghost cities, and there's been so much written. Do they exist? Don't they exist? How bad are they? The point is that there is a huge amount of uninhabited, newly constructed housing throughout China. Um, on top of that, you have empty housing which have been built by developers, which somebody has bought, but has now been held by somebody as an investment property. Because housing prices went up so high, they can't. It's not worth renting this stuff out because the rental yields are so ridiculously low relative to what people paid for them that people just held these apartments empty in the expectation that one day they would recognize the capital gains, because housing prices in China only ever went one direction. They went up and up and up. And I would have said anyone who bought a home in 2014, 15, 16, even as late as 2018, you would have had a fair expectation that the value of what you bought would probably increase 150% over the next decade. That certainly wasn't out of the realm of expectation. It was it was the driver of middle class wealth, buying housing, but it also was kind of this center of a bubble where, because prices kept going up, it made sense for developers to keep borrowing and building more. It made sense for local governments because they could extract so much value out of selling land to just keep finding new land to flatten and to sell. And so everybody was making a huge amount of money out of this, be it the developers, ordinary households who saw their main financial asset just keep going up in value, local governments who were making obscene amounts of money just from selling the land. Everybody was a winner. And so naturally baked into this system, the excesses just kept getting bigger and bigger. The empty homes, the local government's increasing reliance on land sales just to get through the day. And at some point, that bubble was going to pop. And rather than allow the market to pop it on its own terms, the central bank got in first and started taking the air out in what it hoped would be a gradual deflation, and it has been. I mean, it intervened in 2020 and reined in how much reined in how much developers could borrow, and reined in how much the banks could lend. And over that period, I mean, you've seen an absolute collapse in the amount of investment every year in property. In the property sector, you've seen a collapse in prices. I mean, it's difficult to put your finger on how much prices have collapsed because China isn't one housing market. It's like a dozen all over. Every city has a different dynamic. But it's fair to say that housing prices have come down in the big cities at least about 30% from their peak. And because the value of housing is so much less than it used to be, local governments aren't able to shift more than a fraction of the land that they did back in its peak in 2019 and 2020. And so there's this gaping hole in local government finances. It means they're struggling to pay their debts and, even sort of cover their, ordinary budgetary needs. And so that's kind of where we are with the old model. It was real growth until it kind of became a bubble and everybody was sort of trying to, get their take out of it. And since then, the bubble has peaked since 2020. It really, the regulators started taking the air out in 2020. The market peaked in mid 2021. And since then, it's kind of been this slow deflationary letting out of the bubble. And we haven't even seen the end of it yet.
Dinny, it seems to me the big transformation on the political side, and I'm being a little bit Captain Obvious here, is Xi Jinping giving himself a third term in 2022, right? And kind of throwing out the model of rotating power amongst the CCP elite. He's, it's now 4 years later. It looks like he's going for a fourth 5-year term next year, unless you know something I'm unaware of. And so his kind of personalization or centralization of power, even beyond what was true with the CCP, is like the most notable thing, it seems to me, in Chinese politics right now. And there's a whole ton of consequences of that. He's purging folks from the military. He's kind of doing the things that are necessary to hold on to power in a way that's very different than what was going on 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago. Is this a consequence of this change in the economy that you're describing? And how is the kind of this domestic part of the Chinese economy and the real estate and the housing boom and all of that, how is that related to what we're seeing on the political side with Beijing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, to reframe it, it's a question of, is what Xi Jinping doing for the economy ultimately a good thing or a bad thing? Is it turning back the clock? Is it exactly what it needs? I mean, I think if we look at Xi, I think a lot of what he did when he came in, and probably still to this day, has kind of been, as a reaction to some of the excesses and the failings of the previous model. So at the time that I was writing the book that John mentioned, China's shadow banking system had completely run amok. And this kind of fed also into the problem with the property market. The financial system was just was almost this Rube Goldberg machine of just perpetual credit creation. And there seemed to be nothing the regulators could do about it. It seemed to be, no matter what they did, no regulation they imposed, the formal financial institutions would find a way to kind of get around it. And I remember at the time thinking that, everyone was kind of adhering to the letter of the regulations, but were flaunting this, were sort of flouting the spirit. And what Xi Jinping did is he sort of came in and changed that dynamic. Like, I didn't think they'd be able to rein in shadow banking. I thought a financial crisis at some point would be absolutely inevitable because this pile of debt just kept getting bigger and more complicated. And I just thought at some point it would all just come tumbling down. And what he did is he came in and he changed that dynamic. So the letter of the law became less important because clearly financial institutions had found a way to perpetually get around it. What had become important was whether or not you were flouting the spirit. And if you were, then there were repercussions both as an individual and an institution. So we kind of flipped the script and made the financial institution so much more secure than we would have thought was conceivably possible back in 2017. And so Xi has very much put his mark on what this economy looks like. When it comes to the property sector, it was the deflating of that bubble happened on his term. A clear recognition that it could not continue the way that it did, as it was. Very much the same with the shadow banking system. But there was also a realization that if you're doing that, if you're kind of dealing with the excesses of the system in recognition that they can't continue, you have to replace it with something. And this is kind of where Xi's interesting, because if you look at the general consensus, certainly among economists outside of China, but to a certain extent, certain voices in China as well, the only thing that could have conceivably have replaced that property-led, debt-fueled economic growth model was consumption-led growth. Right? That was the only thing that was left. So if you look at any given economy, there are three things which can drive economic activity: consumption by households, investment by firms, investment by the state in infrastructure, and then net exports. So you sell more to foreigners. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but those are the three buckets that you can kind of push forward growth. And there was a sense that China had hit the outer limits of investment, given the bubble in property, given how much local governments had spent on infrastructure and no longer had the resources to do because of the collapse in land sales. And there was also a sense of like, well, you can't do exports anymore. I mean, China is the second biggest economy in the world. It's had export-led growth kind of in the 90s, when it was kind of coming out of its sort of, old sort of Maoist days. And now with an economy this size, I mean, the world can't absorb the scale of exports that would be necessary for China to have an export-led economy. So the only thing that's left is consumption. You've got 1.3, 1.4 billion people. They're consuming far less per head of population than pretty much any other country in the world. The thing that will drive the economy is consumption. As China becomes a more mature economy like developed countries, that is the road that it will take.
And this is the conversation that the U.S. had through every economic dialogue for a decade or two or whatever of trying to persuade the Chinese to support consumption. But so I interrupt you. Please take it wherever you were going. But also, I think it's helpful for people to understand how China sort of suppresses consumption and why that's something that U.S. policymakers were focused on them addressing then, and it's still like what you would hope that they would rotate to today.
Yeah, okay. I'll get to the suppression bit in a sec, but so there was clear, as what you said, there was almost this sense that it was inevitable that almost at some point China would have to get to this economic model, and the US was sort of pushing at it. It's like, look, this is what a mature, global stakeholder of an economy actually looks like. You consume more. And Xi Jinping effectively said no. What China is trying to build at the moment isn't a consumption-led economy, although they do want to eventually get to that point, because they see in a consumption-led economy is a certain degree of economic security. If your own population is what's responsible for generating economic demand every year, that provides you with a certain degree of economic security, much in the way the US works. But in the interim period, before we get to that point, she wants to drive growth with productivity gains, right? Which effectively means doing things more efficiently. It is doing things better. It's about creating things of more value with less. And the way that he's striving to achieve that is with innovation and with industrial upgrading. So the idea is producing new products and ways of doing things which are more efficient and innovative that the rest of the world isn't doing. And it's also about hanging on to all those low-end manufactured goods that China has always produced, the toys, the low-end electronics, the clothing. And those have always been a major source of absorbing creating blue-collar jobs in China. And China now recognizes that blue-collar labor is too expensive in China to be able to compete with Bangladesh or Kenya or wherever else. But they want to hang on to those jobs by replacing people with robots and machines. And so that's kind of the vision. And the reason that it's all about productivity rather than consumption is that they see productivity gains as the key to generating higher paying jobs. Because ultimately, China doesn't want to be, doesn't want to stay at this stage of economic development. It wants to become a developed economy much in the same way as the US and EU is. But to get to that point, it's not just about economic growth anymore. It's about the nature of economic growth, which is why she keeps going on about high quality economic development. It's the nature of the firms and the nature of how you're generating growth has become important. Because but with productivity gains, with innovation, with industrial upgrading, what that does is it creates more profitable firms. And when you have more profitable firms, you're also generating higher paying jobs. I mean, when you're creating your own tech and your own innovation to create top quality electric vehicles and humanoid robots and flying cars and the next generation of tech that China's working on, that creates higher salaries and jobs that have higher bonuses. And when you have that, then you have a broader tax base for the Communist Party, which they can then spend on welfare or geopolitics or however they want to spend it. But that's how she sees the course of development, the way to progress from here to a point where China becomes a bona fide developed economy, rich nation like the US and the EU. That's the path. And they don't want to do consumption-led growth because the way to do consumption-led growth is by wealth redistribution, right? You take away the money from the wealth from those who have it, whether it be sort of, the very rich individuals, or for the most part, it's state-owned enterprises in China. You redistribute that wealth to households, and that ultimately requires taxation. And in this environment, given how weak China's domestic economy is outside of the export sector, they don't have any spare cash to spend on an expansion of welfare. And they certainly don't want to increase the tax base on a domestic economy that really can't support it. And so this is their vision for eventually getting to a point where they can pursue or build a consumption-led economy. It's not by redistribution today to create a consumption-led economy today. It's about building up the wealth and the incomes and the salaries and the tax base that allows them to build a consumption-led economy in 10 or 15 years. That's the vision. And that's why when you keep hearing people, China needs to pivot to a consumption-led economy, Beijing hears it, but it's like, if we do that now, we shoot ourselves in the foot, and it means effectively we can't build a sustainable economic model whereby we are richer and far better off than we are today.
So you have the old model that ran its course, and you have the property sector sort of deflating and dragging down the economy on that side. And instead of rotating into increasing, boosting consumption, they're rotating into industrial development, making old firms more efficient, more productive, and then investing heavily in new technology industry, starting with Project 2025 and the new 5-year plan we have today, and that's the area where that's where the national security community is all these pings of risk have started to emerge and concern over when you think about the U.S. China competition, but it's also, to your point, it's because maybe you can speak more to this, because there isn't the domestic consumption demand that is going to be reliant on exports to foreign consumers.
That's exactly the problem with this particular approach, John. It's like if you are aggressively moving, so all this productivity focus, it's all about manufacturing, right? Because as far as the party sees it, that's where you get the most productivity gains. And so it's all about industry and manufacturing. And so starting in about 2019, prior to when they started deflating the property market, there was a massive increase in the amount of credit going into manufacturing. And it just skyrocketed and it stayed there for years. And you saw this massive expansion in manufacturing capacity. And some of it is related to innovative stuff like your electric vehicles and the renewable energy, drones, flying cars, all that sort of stuff. And some of it is, a lot of it's going into industrial upgrade.
Dinny, can I stop you for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Did you just say flying cars again?
Yeah.
What does that mean? What are you talking about?
It's literally it's literally, think of the Jetsons, Les. This is
Really?
literally what we're talking about. Yeah.
We're doing flying cars now? I didn't know.
Flying cars.
Yeah, it's a lot of the electric vehicle companies and the drone companies, they're all kind of converging on the flying cars thing. China calls it the low altitude economy. They're putting a whole lot of effort into this, not just in terms of subsidies for R&D and whatnot, but like the bureaucratics, the government itself, the bureaucracy, trying to work out what infrastructure do we need to be able to support a low altitude economy of drones and flying cars. What does the physical infrastructure look like? What does the regulatory infrastructure need to look like? Do we need to start training up a generation of urban flight controllers to be able to deal with all of this stuff? So yeah, you'll see, a bunch of, at the auto shows in China, you'll see a bunch of these fairly fancy flying cars. I mean, China's not the only place doing it. I mean, America has its own developers, as does the EU, but politically, China is very invested in this.
It took me an hour to get home last night driving on the ground. I am ready for the flying car thing. Let's go.
I think there's a lot of cities in the world which have been dealing with, like, they just cannot fix their urban infrastructure. This would just, when it finally happens, it's going to be a game changer.
Awesome.
But yeah, anyway, so the problem with investing in manufacturing and innovative new industries and investing so you keep all those old industries that would have traditionally moved somewhere else where it was cheaper to manufacture. When you're doing all that at the same time, what it means is that China's industrial capacity just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and that's by design. Now, the problem is domestic demand in China, like the capacity of ordinary households and local governments to buy and spend is incredibly weak, partly because households have seen their net wealth collapse with property prices, partly because local governments just don't have the money they used to because of the weakness, they can't sell land anymore. So you've got this chronically weak domestic demand situation at the same time that the manufacturing capacity just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So you're producing more, but you can't sell it to your home market, which only leaves the international market, which only leaves exports. And so China is shoveling this stuff abroad. I think what's really interesting is so often we have this sense of China is dumping cheaply the stuff they're making at home overseas. They're dumping it on us. In fact, the dynamic for a lot of these innovative Chinese firms is opposite. The opposite. They go overseas because the competition is far less aggressive than it is at home. So if they can establish an overseas market, they typically can generate higher revenue. They can charge more for their goods overseas than they can in China. So you see that with the auto sector all the time. Those Chinese EV brands that manage to go overseas, there's just far fewer of them. They're not, competing head to head with Chinese firms like the same way they are back at home. So they can charge more than they can back in Shanghai or Guangzhou or Hunan province. And so the ones that go overseas can manage to survive in a way that the ones that don't kind of sort of find it far more difficult.
So can we hone in on this for a minute, because it really gets at their sort of model for developing these new tech industries sort of out of thin air to a large degree. So it's we I think many of us understand the concerns and issues around IP theft or tech transfer or these sorts of things, right? But um, help us understand how they approach this from creating a market for these industries, how they create this extreme competition, what fuels that, and then how that, and then we get into this involution issue, but like how that then drives their is in many cases is successfully driving insane rates of innovation, bringing costs down, making their firms extraordinarily competitive globally. This is what we're seeing in the EV car sector, right?
Yeah. So in a free market, the way that we understand things is that, you have a bunch of firms competing in an industry, and if you're not selling enough at a high enough price, you don't have the resources to pay your debt, pay your workers, pay your rent, and you pretty quickly shut down when the money's not coming in anymore, right? But in China, the dynamic's a little bit different. And I actually think a really good parallel is the experience of Uber versus Lyft, right? Because you had competition between two firms, but the constraint on that competition they weren't competing over profits. They weren't competing over returns to shareholders. They were competing against each other for market share. And they managed to survive far beyond what market dynamics would dictate, because they had venture capitalist backers that were willing to provide the financial resources for them to kind of divvy out subsidies to drivers and riders in an effort to drive the other one out of competition. Because there was a sense that ultimately the winner of this would be the one that had dominant market share and had such dominant market share that they would never again be threatened by the other one, right? And that's kind of the dynamic that's going on in China, that firms in really, it's not just innovative industries. We've seen similar dynamics play out in steel or aluminium in the past, is that firms are able to compete for far longer than they would be under free market conditions because they have some sort of backing from a government institution, right? And that backing might be subsidies. It might be cash subsidies. It might be implicit subsidies, sort of cheap land or utilities. It might be guaranteed contracts. So, if you are producing a car in a certain city and you're backed by that city, you might be a private company, but you've got the implicit backing of that city. That city might insist that all taxis in that area buy this particular brand of car that's made in a local factory. Or they might put up other protectionist barriers. That's something that people aren't really aware of, that internally to China, there are all sorts of, informal protectionist barriers between cities, between provinces, as local governments are trying to protect their own firms. And so that exists as well.
I think that's a really important point. We think of China like through our own lens, and where it's the federal government has such a heavy hand, and if you're going to put real money behind something or subsidy behind something, we do it with the federal balance sheet. But in China, it's like the regional state level banks, the local governments that are developing these champions in these different industries. They get the signal from Project 25 or from the central government that these are the industries to invest in, these are the industries to develop, and they all race to do it, and they compete with each other to do it, and they provide these economic support for these companies to compete to the death.
Absolutely. And once they're set up, once there is a factory and it's selling stuff and it's created jobs, then it's in the interest of local governments to keep that working, because once you're starting to lose jobs, that creates political knock-on effects. And the thing is, as long as that factory is generating sales, the local government is getting tax revenue from VAT. the way that China's Byzantine sort of tax system works out is that there is an incentive for local governments to sustain zombie companies because they're still getting a certain degree of tax revenue in an environment where they're desperate for it. But the burden of keeping companies alive often fall on a state fund that's been set up, or even the financial system. And so
it's also, but back to the consumption point, right? It's also something that significantly depresses wage growth.
Yeah, definitely. To a certain extent, it is. But anyway, so then you've got this system where the local governments have an incentive to kind of support their local champions. And that's kind of why you have so many firms. I mean, I think you had literally hundreds of electric vehicle firms a couple of years ago. That's starting to get whittled down now. I think we're closer to 80. But on a top end, Beijing doesn't pick champions. That's something that local governments do. What Beijing does is it has a vision of the industries it wants to support, and it provides the infrastructure. It provides support for the basic research that needs to go into that industry, or it provides incentives. So it cuts taxes if people buy an electric vehicle, or something I think is really interesting. It supports the build out of the infrastructure that's needed to support a product, like electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Beijing started with support for ensuring that was done in urban areas, and then to boost sales when urban area purchases of EVs kind of hit saturation, it started pushing the electric pile in recharging stations installations in rural areas to kind of support demand there. And so that's the other tier of what's going on. And so you end up in this situation where Beijing's providing sort of top-level support for industries that it's prioritized. Local governments are providing support in a multitude of different ways for champions, allowing them to survive far longer than otherwise would be the case. And then for the firms that are duking it out, well, they're not fighting over profits. They're fighting over market share, because ultimately they realize that if they want, the game here isn't profit maximization. The game here is to be the last man standing, or to be one of the last few standing, because then ultimately, maybe we can start really generating the profits. And so you have this cutthroat competition, and increasingly that competition is manifesting itself in innovation, both in design and technology. If you can come up with a better product than your competitors, that gives you an advantage. But it also manifests itself in prices. And this is what the anti-involution push in Beijing is about at the moment, which is really interesting because for years, China on and off has had overcapacity problems. And I think we all understand the concept of overcapacity, where an industry has built way too many factories to meet demand, however you might define that. But China has deliberately chosen the word involution rather than overcapacity for two reasons. One, on a matter of principle, it doesn't really believe overcapacity can exist in a global free market, because the way they see it is like, well, prices just adjust, right? If we're selling it cheap enough and people are buying it, then where's the overcapacity? And they also sort of argue that when they're, so many of the industries in which they have overcapacity, it's overcapacity with the current demand, global demand, but they're building for future demand. So you look at overcapacity for electric vehicles and solar and wind and whatnot. They're like, well, look, demand for these products is going to be huge in the future. We are building in advance to sort of, meet that demand. But the other part of this involution overcapacity kind of, choice of words is what Beijing is trying to fix and sort of try and stop with involution is price competition. It's Chinese firms fighting each other so aggressively that the nation doesn't enjoy the benefits that it should be extracting from this innovation, right? So what I mean by that is if you've got this incredibly innovative electric vehicle sector, but there are so many firms producing so many new models that the only way they can sell is by cutthroat prices. Now, if they're cutting prices, the firms aren't generating profits. And if they're not generating profits, they're not hiring as many people as they could, and they're not paying them as much as they would. And then on top of that, because they're not generating particularly good profits, it doesn't flow onto the state in tax revenue. And so those are all the benefits that China should be getting from its new model. But it's not, because of the nature of its competition, that the way that it's building up these industries means that these firms are engaged in cutthroat competition that isn't generating any profits. Anti-involution is trying to create a situation where prices prices can go up, profits can go up, wages can go up, and so can tax revenue.
Isn't all of this just creating another bubble, Denny? Much like and I completely defer to you on the, how do you describe what a bubble is? But this kind of market intervention and subsidy and that kind of thing can't help but distort what the market would have done under similar circumstances, right? Aren't there going to be bad long-term consequences for exactly these decisions, much like there was for the subsidies of the real estate market and building new housing and that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, it certainly feels that way. And I think that's why the export sector is just so important to them at the moment, right? They need to keep selling more and more of this stuff to be able to minimize the degree to which those wasteful investments don't translate into bad loans. I think that's where we are. I mean, on one level, I think Beijing feels like it's got a long track record of quite successfully managing bad debts in the system, and that it can absorb more and it'll fix it. But there's another problem here at the moment, and that is, even with this new productivity focused model, which by definition should be low debt, right? If you're generating growth from productivity, you don't need to be shoveling more debt into the system to generate growth. But the reality is China's debt burden just keeps going up and up. I mean, the debt to GDP ratio is kind of heading to the moon at the moment. And that's partly because, the property sector collapsed. You can't replace the lost economic activity just with an expansion of manufacturing and exports. You kind of need to sort of fill that gap with additional debt, with infrastructure, with new factory construction. So if you look at China's debt to GDP, I think it was Tsinghua University calculates it quarter on quarter. So China's debt to GDP ratio is like 310% at the moment. I think the United States is 280%. Japan is only at 340% at the moment. I mean, at the current trajectory, China will take over Japan as the world's most heavily indebted economy within 5 years. And so
they're going up like 10% a year too, or 9% or something right now.
I think if you use the BIS calculations, I think it's gone up 50 percentage points since the middle of 2021. So what's that? Let's say 5-ish years. So yeah, about 10 percentage points a year. And if that keeps going, it's difficult to see it not keep going because domestic demand is so weak. The only thing sort of keeping the economy going the way that it is exports. So I'm not sure if the waste that we're seeing necessarily turns into a bubble. Sorry, the investment we're seeing, this sort of doubling down on manufacturing results in a bubble, but it's certainly the risk of huge waste is very, very real. And I think the consequences are, it kind of manifests itself in this rising debt level that kind of becomes harder and harder to manage, particularly as China's population gets older.
Denny, can I ask you one more question? And then I defer to John, but we might be running out of time here. My amateur understanding of Chinese history over time is that there's always been tension between the prosperous coastal areas and the impoverished internal areas. And there's some reason to believe that there's that tension now in Chinese society. How does this stuff play out against that kind of backdrop? And is there an integrity of the state question ultimately for Beijing?
I don't think so. I mean, certain parts of the country are really suffering. I mean, the Northeast is seeing a net decrease in population. A lot of parts of the country are seeing a net decrease in population just because of the whole one child policy thing. But particularly in the Northeast, there's a real exodus of young people because they see no opportunities. But then you take a province like Inner Mongolia, which traditionally has been a bit of an economic backwater and is one of the fastest growing economically provinces in China at the moment because of China's commitment to renewable energy. in some ways it's kind of like a Saudi Arabia of renewables with wind and solar and all this hydrogen, and so it's doing incredibly well. And so I think Beijing is trying to kind of look at the unique characteristics of various provinces and see if it can kind of build them up. So yeah, there's always been a tension, but I think I don't necessarily think it always has to be that way. I think Beijing's mindful of trying to improve things where it can.
So you have this uh, economic plan that is rotated into more advanced manufacturing and heavily dependent on exports. That is running headlong into advanced economies in obviously with the U.S. and across Europe and in some parts of Asia, where we're now competing at the leading edge, and the market, many industries, many sectors are feeling the brunt of this export-led growth, and again in sectors that are much more sensitive to domestic economies, but also if you talk about the auto sector, but also sensitive from a geopolitical and strategic national security standpoint, with advanced tech in many areas. So that seems to be the confrontation or the challenge now, and we have the U.S. Like I talked about at the top, sort of flailing around with different attempts of answers at that. We've sort of kept the Chinese auto industry out of the United States thus far. Europe is starting to really confront these issues in a more serious way, but it's always much more challenging for them to take action as a unified response. Any final sort of thoughts or comments on how you see that all of that coming together over the next couple of years?
The solution to this, I really have no idea. I mean, the last time we were here was with Japan in the 1980s, but this is a far more severe. The degree of the shock is far greater than anything sort of Japan brought to the table, and the solution won't be the same. I mean, China, the state has studied in great depth the experience of Japan, the Plaza Accords, the Louvre Accords, the economic consequences to the Japanese economy in the 90s, and it has no interest in pursuing some sort of currency revaluation. The way the Chinese state, talking to the media, talks about it is that, look, ultimately this is how things should be. We're incredibly efficient. We're producing things far more cheaply. It's the rest of the world's responsibility to buy what we're doing. That's how markets work. I think that's kind of where China is coming from. And even if that's not entirely sincere, I think where they are at the moment is they can't afford to deliberately or willingly pare back their exports, regardless of how that framework might work, because it's so central to maintaining growth, to sort of achieving their growth targets, and eventually delivering that increase in prosperity that I was talking about before. I mean, ultimately, what the world wants is for China to go back and create a consumption-led economy, not in 10 years' time where its prosperity has kind of come at the expense of a whole lot of advanced manufacturing in the developed world. They want it to happen. We want it to kind of happen now, whereby, the interesting thing with consumption in China is that you look at the big cities, and clearly Chinese people they consume a lot. But that's not the issue. The issue is that the percentage of the national wealth that goes to individuals, to households, is far less than it is in the rest of the world. I think it's 40% in China relative to 60, 70% in most of the other countries. And what that means is people get paid less. They get paid less in dividends. There's less that's sort of paid out to households in the form of sort of healthcare or social security. Than really anywhere else in the world. And in fact, instead, the national wealth sort of pools in the hands of state-owned enterprises and private sector firms, which allow them to reinvest far more cheaply than would be otherwise the case. So what the world wants is looks at China with its 1.3 billion people and says, we need Chinese households to buy more stuff, to buy more of their own stuff, and ultimately to buy more of what we're producing as well. And Beijing isn't willing to sort of give on that, at least for the time being. So I don't know what the solution is. I feel like the way we were going is that I think Beijing will push to maintain the status quo as long as it can, try and play the EU nations off against each other, push back against the US with sort of rare earths and what other levers it has for the time being. But I kind of feel at some point in the next few years, something's got to break.
Dinny, thanks. This has been tremendous. Les, any final thoughts?
We need to do a whole episode on the flying car thing.
Done. Hannah, let's get it booked. Thanks again, Denny. Really appreciate it. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks to Hannah Haynes, Claude Jennings, and NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us on Friday, July 31st for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart, fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. We're on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.